Hello ladies and gentlemen, this week for geography we are going to look at the idea of temporal variation. But before we do that, just a reminder about some study tasks. So obviously last week you were collecting your data and starting to plan out those essays for the RGS competition about climate change. So if you can submit the first draft of that to me by the 10th of July to that email address, that would be good. And the final deadline for submissions to the Royal Geographical Society competition is September 30th, so we will try and aim to get them ready for the start of September. The second study task this week we are going to be looking at the recent protests as an example of conflict within society. Now, conflict can be sort of peaceful, can be violent conflict. This is probably an example more of kind of peaceful conflict in most cases. But your task this week is to create a 5 to 10 minute presentation about another conflict example. So you must include what has caused the conflict, what the scale and the impacts of that conflict are, and indeed any management of that conflict that has occurred, and whether there are any future implications of that conflict. And if you can do, I would like you to record that presentation and send it to me again, to that edward.hawkins email address by Friday the 26th of July. So today we are going to be looking at the concept of temporal variation. So understanding how things vary over time, and we'll use that to analyse some of the specialised concepts in geography, causality, sustainability, feedback in systems, mitigation and adaptation, resilience and risk, and thresholds. Now, when we're talking about temporal variation, we are also thinking about scale, but in terms of time scale rather than spatial scale this time. So typically that is going to look at things in perhaps the short term initially. So typically that's kind of up to 2 weeks from an event. It will look at things in the medium term, so typically that's going to be weeks and months, but can be as much as up to kind of 2 years or a couple of years. And then we'll look at longer terms, and typically that's going to be sort of over 2 years, and in some cases, particularly when you're looking at sort of things in physical geography, it can look at things on a kind of decade scale or millennium scale. And to do this, we're going to look at the recent protests that have been taking place. So we're going to look at the example in the news of the death of George Floyd as the example of one of the causes of these protests. And there is an article there that I would like you to read. And from that article, I would like you to try and identify what the short-term and the long-term causes of the current protesting are. Another way to analyse things is to look at the issues and the impacts that those issues have. So again, to assess this, I'd like you to find out more about the Black Lives Matter campaign, and there is a link there to the main sort of webpage for the Black Lives Matter campaign. And I'd like you to assess what the possible impacts of this campaign are likely to be on a short-term scale, so sort of over the next couple of weeks, what they're likely to be on a medium-term scale, so up to kind of 2 years from now, and what they're likely to be on kind of a longer-term scale, so kind of 10 years and beyond, the impacts of that. And the reason we look at these is they help us to analyse and explain information, but also they link to a number of specialised concepts. So we're going to look at some of those. So the first of those is this idea of causality. So the idea that everything that occurs in the world has a cause and an effect, and that there is a connection between the cause and the consequential effect. This is important, and understanding the cause and effect on different timescales can help us with the management of phenomenon through things like prevention, mitigation, and adaptation, particularly if we're talking about things in sort of more physical geography, perhaps. So it's kind of preventing damage from wildfires, mitigating against wildfires, and adapting to sort of survive in a place where there are regular wildfires. But we can also apply this to the recent protests. So I've asked you to look at the causes and the impacts of the recent protests. And once you've done that, try to assess the link between the causes and the impacts on a variety of timescales. And also think about what management could be introduced for the protests. So try to think of ways we could prevent the protests from being needed in the first place, and ways we could adapt to ensure that the protesters and the protests being carried out are safe in the current environment, particularly around COVID-19. The second very important concept is this idea of sustainability. And you guys will remember that there's kind of 3 pillars of sustainability from your GCSE. The social pillar, the economic pillar, and the environmental pillar. And they all kind of overlap a little bit, and they're all interlinked as part of sustainability. And when assessing sustainability, obviously you need to look at the three pillars of sustainability. But again, you also need to assess on a variety of timescales. So likewise, when you've had a look at the information about the Black Lives Matter campaign, try to assess whether you think this is going to have an impact on sustainability at all. And that could be social sustainability, it could be economic sustainability, or less likely could be environmental sustainability. And how could these make an assessment of how we could measure the impacts of this over time? Another very important concept, again, that timescales will link to is this idea of feedback. So you remember there's positive and negative feedback. So positive feedback will obviously enhance an initial change. Negative feedback will reduce or nullify it. And if the economics of a country is viewed as a system, the protests could cause both positive and negative feedbacks on a variety of temporal scales. For example, inequality is one of the causes of the protest, arguably. So the protest could raise awareness about this, which could allow for greater investment in deprived areas, which could reduce inequality in the future. So as a result, this could be seen as an example of a negative feedback loop because it is reducing that initial inequality. But this is also likely to be something that is not going to happen in the short term. It's likely to be a longer term change if this does happen. So you can see how that has an impact when you look at different timescales. The other thing to assess when we're looking at timescales is this idea of risk. So risk is the likelihood of a negative consequence occurring due to particular events. So this can be assessed by different spatial scales, so looking at kind of risk on a kind of national scale, on a local scale, or indeed on a global scale. It can be looked at on a variety of timescales, and it can be assessed through different identities of people. For example, different groups will have different levels of vulnerability. So women, actually globally, are more likely to experience a negative consequence in a national disaster, as globally there are less resources available to women than men because of inequality. So understanding that is an important part of understanding the impacts of something. And a big part of assessing risk is linked to the resilience of an area or a group to cope with a particular action being taken. And resilience in geography is that ability for a system or a community to return to previous conditions after a traumatic event. And an example, again, how quickly a community is able to recover from a hurricane will be linked to the economic power of that community. So it's likely those with higher economic power would be viewed, in this case, as more resilient to that disaster. And then this idea of thresholds as well, very important. A threshold is a tipping point in a system, which once passed, it will be very difficult for that system to return to previous conditions. Now, usually we link a threshold to kind of detrimental effects. For example, tipping points in climate are generally viewed as very negative. And once you pass the tipping point, we're probably not going to be able to reverse a warming trend. So we view those as very negative. For a population, it can be viewed as the maximum level of disruption a population could experience, say, from an earthquake, before that damage could not be repaired. And as an example, the Haiti earthquake in 2012 arguably past that point, as many of the areas in Haiti have not been rebuilt after this. So again, you can use this idea for risk, resilience, and threshold to think about the protests. To think about the protests, both the peaceful ones that have taken place in recent days and the ones that have sadly become violent in recent days. and try to understand what the risk factors were for these protests, which groups of people you think are most vulnerable to negative consequences and therefore have the lowest resilience as a result of these protests, and whether there are any thresholds, so once a point is passed, we won't be able to return to kind of previous conditions. And try to assess these on a variety of spatial and temporal scales. And there are articles on the link on the next slide which will help you as well. So you will see this is from Politics, Group and Identities, which is run by Taylor Francis Group. And there's lots of articles that you can read that will hopefully help you with gaining your understanding. So yeah, good luck with that, and do email me if you have any questions about it.